order. Hearing is now resumed.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. Just before I commence back to my remarks, I wanted to pick up on a topic mentioned briefly by Mr. Taylor in his remarks on Friday. It deals with the consideration that both the Conservation Coalition and the Aquaculture Coalition asked in their submissions for you to consider, and that was that the release of all of the documents in Ringtail be made public, in the words of the Aquaculture Coalition, so that they're not secret and so that they're not lost to the public. I would support the position taken by Canada, which is that if the Commission is thinking of doing that, we'd be provided an opportunity to make submissions on that. I won't spend much more time on it, other than to say that hundreds of thousands of documents were produced. There's a rigor around why they become exhibits and why they aren't, and for them to be released into the public, I think would provide a chilling effect on future inquiries. That's not the least of my concerns. In addition, some of the opponents of aquaculture have a propensity of using half a document or a quote out of order, and we don't need to have that battle again and again. The suggestion by the Conservation Coalition that they'd be useful in a future audit by DFO is easily handled. DFO can simply make available to an audit the many hundreds of thousands of documents that they produced. So I would be opposed to you making a ruling that without us being provided an opportunity to make further submissions. I'd like to drill into some of the topics that I discussed in a cursory way before the lunch break, and start, if I may, with a precautionary approach to regulation and management of the aquaculture industry, since clearly this is the way in which the aquaculture industry is managed in this day and age. And we indicate that the Canadian law recognizes the precautionary principle can be tempered with adaptive management, and it's not considered to be a zero-risk approach. We say that in British Columbia, the precautionary approach and adaptive management together has been the hallmark of how the industry has been regulated both by the province and by Canada, and that a number of precautionary measures are taken on by the industry itself to minimize any risks. First and foremost among that precautionary approach and adaptive management is the whole issue of the farm fish health data and the database that, Mr. Commissioner, you've had the opportunity to review with your counsel, and other participants have as well. And that database is there. It demonstrates to the regulators the status of the fish health, and provides an ongoing, sort of in real time, check and balance to demonstrate the health of the fish in the pens. And as you know, it's supplemented by the external auditing by traditionally been done by the province. I'm, as I indicated earlier, I'm not going to ask Mr. Lund to pull documents up on the screen, but I can, just for the purpose of the record, direct from time to time the Commission to a reference that I'm making, and that last reference with respect to monitoring fish health, you can read in greater detail at Exhibit 1668, which is a review of the British Columbia Ministry of Agriculture and Lands Fish Health Audit and Surveillance Program. Again, I'll also quote some paragraphs from our submissions, and in all cases, it'll be from our final submission as opposed to our reply, unless I indicate otherwise. And so paragraph 86 of our submission, we comment on the robust and reliable nature of the fish health data and the evidence that points in that direction, including from most of the fish health professionals who gave evidence. Dr. McKenzie indicated that there was an audit program in addition to the daily farm sampling program, which helped give greater confidence to the results. And similarly, Dr. Corman suggested the problems on farms in terms of fish health data would be easily found in the data. In our submissions between pages 49 and 62, we discuss resource management decision-making and sustainable development. And we cite Exhibit 8, wild salmon policy, and the references there to the precautionary approach, and point out that in addition to the sort of traditional environmental considerations, it requires a consideration of reliable and credible scientific research, but in conjunction with socioeconomic considerations in management decisions where any uncertainty exists. And it's important to understand that it is a socioeconomic issue as well as pure science. And I won't spend much time, but you've heard evidence, and I'm sure it's fresh from some of the submissions even this morning, that it's the aquaculture industry provides a significant benefit to the local coastal communities. You may recall the evidence where it was indicated that an annual minimum wage of $32,000 is doubled by Aboriginal persons working, and others, but Aboriginal persons as well, working in the farm sites. Doubled for those working in the fish processing plants, and tripled by those working in farm sites to $32,000 and $48,000 respectively. And the Aboriginal Aquaculture Association produced a document which indicated that about 108 Aboriginal persons employed in salmon farming operations earned about $5.5 million annually, and another 178 Aboriginal persons employed in the processing side of the operations, almost another $6 million annually. We also say that when one examines Exhibit 216, the Aquaculture Policy Framework, it discusses in part the effect of fish farming on reducing pressure on wild fish stocks. And Dr. Hyatt agreed that aquaculture, if properly assessed and rigorously managed, could reduce pressures on wild fish stocks in aggregate. At our paragraph 100, we quote Exhibit 8, Wild Salmon Policy, and note that DFO has a role to manage aquaculture so that it's environmentally sustainable, socially responsible, and economically viable in a manner consistent with other human activities. So really it's a very broad sweep of considerations that DFO manages in managing the industry. You heard from a number of witnesses, Mr. Commissioner, about biosecurity, and it's found in the evidence, the transcript of August the 29th, Corman, Connors, Noakes, and Dill, and later on September the 6th, Dr. Succeeda, describing biosecurity and best management practices in place. You may recall that questions were posed to a number of witnesses who indicated that, in their view, salmon farms could coexist with wild salmon. It was the Aboriginal Aquaculture Coalition who framed their question quite simply and really profoundly to several different panels. And our scorecard has Drs. Kent, Stephen, Noakes, Dill, Corman, Connors, Succeeda, and Jones agreeing with the proposition that they could coexist, that is, salmon farms with wild salmon. In addition, there were papers that are previously published, including ones by Dr. Beamish, Dr. Marty, and Dr. Succeeda, that expressed that same opinion. It's important to understand the nature of the business. The nature of the business is to have live fish swimming in open pens in the ocean. And so in order to manage that physical plant, fish health professionals agreed universally that biosecurity and fish health management plans are an effective way to reduce the risk of pathogen transfer from salmon farms and to minimize that. It was agreed on August the 31st when you heard from Drs. Marty, McKenzie, and Shepard that as experts in the area of management of fish health and aquaculture, they had a high confidence that the risk of disease in salmon farms is manageable with appropriate care and attention. And you might recall that Mr. Schweifeger, who was on that panel, threw in a management viewpoint briefly at the end of that exchange where he agreed with that proposition from a management perspective. And again, I'd commend you to the reading of the transcript on August 31st to review that information. At our paragraph 110, we cite a paper that was co-authored by Dr. Marty and Dr. Succeeda and entered as Exhibit 1555, which dealt with the coordinated fouling and closed containment and concluded that they're not necessary to protect wild salmon from salmon farms. Dr. Succeeda, in her evidence, September 6th, commented that on a recent paper by Morton and others, Exhibit 1557, showed that fouling of farms did not make a difference to the salmon population. In fact, there were poorer returns in areas that had been fallowed. We discussed closed containment in a variety of different parts of our submissions, Mr. Commissioner, and at our paragraph 111, we discuss that the evidence requiring drastic action, such as shutting down all salmon farms along the migratory route and moving to closed containment, is not supported by the evidence in terms of the risk management approach, nor is it viable. We heard from evidence reports filed by the BC Salmon Farmers Association and verbal evidence from Mr. Claire Backman of Marine Harvest, who spoke to one of those papers indicating that it's not commercially viable. And while they're undertaking joint studies, in some cases in conjunction with and in cooperation with some of the environmental groups, they're not yet there. Closed containment does not work in terms of an economic model at this point. When we heard from Mr. David Marmorick, and he was asked the question with respect to the precautionary principle or the precautionary approach, and the question of whether salmon farms should be relocated, his answer, and you can go to the transcript references cited at our paragraph 111, referring to his evidence in September the 20th, says that he recommended continuing collecting data from wild fish prior to making any management decisions in that regard. And Dr. Noakes, his evidence on August the 29th indicated that the data does not support closing salmon farms and that husbandry and health management minimize risks to wild salmon. We discussed the issue of protection of wild salmon on migration routes in our pages. It says 63 to 138. That sounds a little long. We'll say commencing on page 63. We say that the evidence demonstrates that properly managed aquaculture can coexist in the marine environment, and that the government and industry are aware of the need to protect any impact with migration routes of wild salmon, and do so through siting criteria and environmental assessments and through the fish health management plans, biosecurity, and an area-wide approach to siting and monitoring salmon farms. It's interesting to note that there's evidence that salmon stocks such as Fraser River pink salmon are increasing in abundance, and that those stocks migrate past salmon farms. So while this commission has been convened to determine what's been the reason for the drastic decline in Fraser River sockeye, and fingers have been pointed towards the aquaculture industry, pinks from the Fraser River have been increasing in abundance at the same time. So it seems that there are different factors at play. Often when one refers to the migration route, the topic of Harrison River sockeye comes up, and it seems conclusive proof for some that because the Harrison stock appear to migrate through the Strait of Juan de Fuca, that must be the evidence. But we note in our paragraph 130, citing Exhibit 748, the Drs. Peterman and Dorner report, Technical Report 10, that although the Harrison River sockeye have different life cycle, Washington Lake sockeye with a similar migration route are also decreasing in productivity, suggesting that the different migration route is not the sole reason for Harrison River salmon increasing in productivity. And they go on to discuss some notable differences in the life cycle of Harrison River sockeye. I won't get into them in detail, but fundamentally, Mr. Commissioner, you'll recall that Harrison fish migrate to sea in the first year of life as fry instead of overwintering in fresh water. Then their resident time in the Strait of Georgia is also different. So we'd say in conclusion, and this is adopted actually, these are the remarks of Drs. Peterman and Dorner, that they say, thus the reason for the Harrison's exceptional trend is probably not attributable simply to its different migration route. I note further that there's really very little evidence in terms of the Harrison River migration route, and Dr. Peterman speaks to that point when he says that there was only one study, which is very limited evidence, or his words, that suggests they may exit through the Strait of Juan de Fuca and up the west coast of Vancouver Island. Dr. Peterman suggested that due to their different life history, in particular their body size, it might make them less vulnerable to whatever stressors causing mortality for other fish. So we've taken it almost as accepted truth that the Fraser River sockeye, that the Harrison River sockeye migrate in a certain pattern, but it bears recalling the evidence of Dr. Peterman that there's one study which he says very limited evidence to that effect. I need to spend some considerable time on the Project 5, the salmon farming report, the technical reports commissioned by the Commission. It'll be our submission that the four advisors to the Commission, led by Drs. Dill and Noakes, concluded there was no significant relationship between salmon farms and Fraser River sockeye decline. Dr. Noakes and Dr. Dill generally agreed that most aquaculture factors critics usually say contributed to decline actually don't pose risks. And I won't go through them in great detail, but you'll recall that they agreed that waste escapes of Atlantics from the farms and sea lice are unlikely to have made a significant contribution. Dr. Noakes went a little further and said that escaped Atlantics and waste discharges from from farms moved the risk from minuscule to approaching zero. And the references I've just made you can find in Exhibits 1575 of the David Namarick Addendum to Technical Report 6, as well as both the notes and Dill reports. Notes at 1536 and Dill at 1540. Another observation, and this seemed to be glossed over by people when they were discussing the potential impact of sea lice, is the different types of sea lice which might affect Atlantics, or indeed a variety of Pacific species. But less thoroughly covered, I suggest, during the commission were the pathogenomic risks of pathogenomic differences between the Atlantic Lepsalmonus and the Pacific version of the Lepsalmona. And our paragraph 146, we discussed that in some detail, that the Pacific are genetically different than the Atlantic and appear to be less pathogenic and more sensitive to environmental conditions. Doctors Jones and Saxida co-authored a paper which showed that differences of pathology by way of examining the frequency of treatments in BC at salmon farms compared to Norway and Scotland. And we refer to that in our paragraph 146, and their transcript evidence is cited at the bottom of that paragraph. So, proof of the differences are found in the treatment regimes that the salmon farms use on the farms. And of course, you heard several times, and this seemed to be a surprise to some participants, that the salmon farms are not treating the lice for the benefit of the Atlantics. They're treating the lice on the Atlantics at a time and place and at an intensity to meet with their obligations and to favor any, minimize any risk and place the migrating wilds in a favorable position vis-a-vis the lice which the salmon farms might otherwise be shedding. There was a discussion about whether sea lice could be acting as a disease vector, and at our paragraph 170, we've summarized part of the evidence of Dr. Jones that he gave on September the 6th, where he says, quote, "My sense is that from what we've heard and what we've described today, the spread of the disease that's specifically due to sea lice is not a significant issue as it relates to the health of wild salmon populations." Close quote. They go on to speak that it does not act as a disease vector. Now, time for the ping pong match or the tennis match. I really must get into the Dr. Noakes, Dr. Connors controversy, because fundamentally, Noakes and Dill, as the two principal authors, approached their task differently. Noakes, his background is different than Dill, and he did a fine-scale farm-by-farm analysis looking at all the fish health data. Tellingly, Dill in his report refers to the fish farm data being aggregated, because of course Connors aggregated it. So Dill in his report seems to suggest he didn't know that there was 120 farms on a farm-by-farm basis. He refers specifically to the aggregated data, that wasn't as good. So he's clearly relying on Connors, who did aggregate it for his reasons of showing the correlations, which I'll speak to in a minute. So the fact that Dill comes to different conclusions than Noakes is hardly surprising, both by the way they approach the data, their apparent working knowledge of the data, and their two different scientific disciplines in examining the data. And perhaps the explanation for Dill is, well, I had Connors, so Connors did for me what Noakes was able to do on his own. It's not that simple, and hence the ping pong match. Clearly, Connors and Noakes approach this differently. Now, I remind you, Mr. Commissioner, that Connors was the graduate student of Dill, and there's a very close association there. And perhaps that's why Dr. Dill was quite comfortable in relying on Dr. Connors' assessment, but he made some fundamental flaws, which I really must get into in some detail. We're not asking you to prefer Dr. Noakes because we like his evidence better. We're saying that when you look at Dr. Noakes' evidence and assessment on a fine-scale farm-by-farm analysis, and you look at the way in which Dr. Connors aggregated it, and the assumptions that he made and the flaws in those assumptions, one is drawn to the fact that you must disregard much of the Connors evaluation, and when you do, you must disregard much of the comments that Dr. Dill makes, since they flow from it. one of the points that Dr. Noakes made, and I'm referring to our paragraph 135, that would be the Noakes transcript of August the 26th, and also David Mamrick transcript of September 19th, which the page and lines are footnoted, of course, in our submissions. While Dr. Noakes commented that the fish health data time series was relatively short, he commented that the Fraser River sockeye salmon data included historic high returns of 2010 and historic low returns of 2009, which provides contrast, which Mr. Mamrick explained was necessary to determine the likelihood of relationships. As Dr. Noakes put it to us, and perhaps like many of us, I listened to him and I tried to understand what he was saying, but I don't recall doing very well in my second year business statistics class 35 years ago. But he did say that when he had a chance to look at the length of why the short-term analysis had failed to detect a significant relationship, he said that when you put in the 09 and the 010 returns, they had more statistical power. Now you will recall that Dr. Connors didn't look at 2010. So again, Dill wasn't qualified to and or didn't look at it on a farm-by-farm basis. Connors didn't look at the relevant piece of information that Connors didn't look at the relevant piece of information that Noakes looked at, which included the 2010 historic highs, which gave it the statistical power. Dr. Corman described it this way in our paragraph 136. Dr. Corman said, the negative effects of salmon farms on the return of Fraser River sockeye between 2000 and 2010 were not apparent from the data. Fraser River salmon demonstrated exceptionally low and high returns in 2009 and 2010 respectively. The number of mortalities on farms potentially caused by disease remained constant, while high-risk diseases and sea lice levels declined. Given the reliability of the fish health data from the industry and the rigor of the audit program, it is significant that the Commission Project 5 experts agree that there is no strong signal in the data. So here we have an ability to look at the highs and lows. Noakes took it to a fish farm level, which Connors didn't do, and it's not surprising that with that assessment and with his skill set, he reached slightly different conclusions. Connors testified, paragraph 137, Connors testified that he aggregated the data. He did not assume migration routes. Dill's report, 1540, criticized the farm data for being aggregated by fish health zone, which precluded a breakdown according to proximity on the farms to the presumed migration routes of the majority of juvenile Fraser River sockeye. That's a quote. Well, that's not true. It was broken down on a farm-by-farm basis, and apparently, even at the writing of his report, he seemed unaware of that. However, Drs. Corman, Connors, and Noakes all testified the data was not aggregated, as we well know, and was available on a farm-by-farm basis. This shows that Dill not only relied exclusively on Connors' report, but he didn't even look at all the available data. And the transcript references that cover part of this, Mr. Commissioner, on August the 26th. And the references to Dill are found in his report at page 16. Noakes indicated that he did, in fact, a fine-scale farm-by-farm analysis of the data that he said could have been done and should have been done in order to determine where high-risk disease events occurred and whether there was a risk of pathogen transfer. Not only did this action increase the power of the Noakes analysis, it led him to conclude, quote, the evidence suggests that disease originating from salmon farms has not contributed to the decline of the Fraser River sockeye salmon, close quote. Noakes further testified that the analysis showed the farms are, quote, very unlikely to have contributed any exposure to pathogens, close quote. So there's a reason why they have differences, and this reference that I've made and this portion of our written submissions, it gets into this in further detail. On the question of expertise, we comment on paragraph 174 that Dr. Connors is not an expert in the areas which Dr. Noakes had significant criticisms. Dr. Connors is not qualified as a fisheries climate interaction or time series analyst. Dr. Connors' long-term analysis was dependent upon fisheries climate interactions and specifically sea surface temperatures and time series analysis. So we say that he's out of his depth and that Dr. Noakes is an expert in these areas. Another aspect of Dr. Noak's report, which he looked at in his Exhibit 1536, is he says it's much more reasonable to consider the relationship between sockeye pink chum abundance in the North Pacific and Fraser River sockeye productivity, because there's a strong evidence that sockeye pink and chum salmon have a very high overlap at the trophic level, and that there's likely to be negative interactions among these species through competition. He said, and it's covered in his transcript on August the 26th, there is evidence that pink chum production, as indexed by catch, in the North Pacific has responded to shifts in ocean conditions in synchronous fashions, with the reverse pattern of changes (shifts) being observed for sockeye salmon, citing a Noakes and Beamish 2009 report. He said it does not make sense to consider pink salmon abundance only, given the significant trophic overlap of these three species, sockeye, pink, and chum, and particularly when no significant relationship was found between the abundance of pink salmon in the North Pacific and the Fraser River sockeye production when they were considered independently. Noakes went on in the ping pong match, and I'm nearly done, to say that Connors also failed to take a certain number of pre-analytical steps, and that he did not perform the necessary analytical diagnostics to the data. I don't know what that means exactly, but that's why we have Dr. Noakes, who's the statistician, who indicates that in his opinion, Dr. Connors failed to take necessary pre-analytical steps. Appropriate for Connors to simply look at salmon farm production data, specifically when farm production was increasing while high-risk disease events were not. So let's think about this. We have Connors looking merely at the salmon numbers, farm production, and it's increasing, but disease is going down, but he doesn't look at it in that perspective. And you'll also recall that Noakes actually identified farm by farm, and the handful of high-risk events that he found, I think, were overwhelmingly, maybe 6 for 6 or 5 for 6, were off of what we had described as the main migration pattern for Fraser River sockeye. Some were in the Seashell Inlet, as I recall, one from memory, and some, I believe, were external to the main migration route, perhaps on the west coast. In any event, when he looked at it, and he took these high-risk events and placed them on a farm-by-farm basis, something that Connors didn't do and couldn't do, or didn't have the skill sets to do, partially describes the differences in their conclusions. There's also the question, frankly, of bias. I won't get into it in any great detail, but at paragraph 183 in our submissions, we describe what we say to be the bias of Dr. Connors in the way in which he used silvers in his analysis in a way to increase the likelihood of finding a relationship. So in summary, we say Noakes ought to be accorded more weight than Dill, and where Noakes and Connors have disagreed, there's a reason for that disagreement, and the diligence and skill sets that are different provides Dr. Noakes in a better position to advise the Commission of the matters that he spoke of and wrote on. I want to speak now, if I may, on farm siting, the process for siting farms, and protection of the migratory route of wild salmon through that process. And generally speaking, I'm between pages 87 and 96 in our submissions. At our paragraph 186, we talk about siting criteria used by salmon farmers under the province that were put in place as far back as March of 2000. And we note that the list has been adopted by Canada in applications for aquaculture sites that they're now handling. It's important to note that the way that process unfolds, and we describe that in the next several paragraphs, including at paragraph 187, the company will collect information necessary to satisfy a site application, including for SIA screenings. That information is the responsibility of the applicant for completing and submitting it to both Canada and to the province. Some of the information that they have to provide deals specifically with fish habitat, and that means including migration areas, so these matters are all taken into account. You might recall the evidence, I believe it was from Ms. Parker, who, when asked to describe the protective measures in Norway and the protective measures in British Columbia as it relates to migration, there was a map that was on the wall one day, and we saw small bright red portions of the Norwegian coast which were no-go zones, no salmon farms. And Ms. Parker indicated, well, the entire BC coast is a migration pattern because the Fraser River's at the bottom of our coast and the salmon are migrating up the length of the coast. And so the way it's dealt with in British Columbia is the aquaculture industry has identified numerous fish-bearing streams that were never known before. In other words, the database is much more refined, and salmon farms are excluded from all areas where there's salmon rearing and salmon spawning areas. So we looked to the Norway experience to say, well, they've got these national protected strategy, there's no fish farms, and we look at our salmon farming industry in British Columbia and we say each and every single salmon farm takes into account migrating salmon and where they spawn. It's been a part of the application process for 10 years. So to say that BC and the federal government haven't been responsive to the needs of sighting salmon relative to migration patterns of wild salmon is just patently false. Once the applicants have provided the information, biologists at DFO review the information. All applications undergo a detailed biological environmental review. There's discussions about habitat compensation, which may and commonly is required by DFO. And again, to look for this in greater detail, I commend the reading of Exhibit 1594, Finfish Aquaculture License, which was filed, and the transcript evidence of September the 8th on this topic. We know that the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act, or SIA screening, consider a wide range of valued ecosystem components. SIA screenings consider potential risks to wild fish population and mitigation measures to deal with and assess each risk. A quote from Ms. Parker on September the 8th was, I can say with some confidence that salmon habitat, fish habitat, and fish population level effects are considered in SIA screenings. This really came about as part of the cross-examination of Ms. Parker by some of the other participants, indicating that that was not the case. And Ms. Parker seemed to have a very good working knowledge of how SIA screenings unfolded at the industry level. Once a siting or licensing decision has been made, we comment in our paragraph 192 that following approval, there's a whole range of monitoring and oversight of environmental effects of these operations. So these farms are sited with great care. Permits are granted. The industry doesn't just get to put down their farm wherever they want, and then once it's there, it's monitored. Who's it monitored by? Well, we know that it's monitored by levels of government. We also heard that the industry monitors and reports to regulators, and this is very common in this day and age. Many industrial groups monitor and self-report compliance and non-compliance, and it's a breach of a condition of license in many industries to fail to do so or to do so inaccurately. And in addition, we heard from Mr. Backman, Claire Backman of Marine Harvest, and his evidence of September the 8th, where he described a third tier of monitoring, that being the ISO 14000 certification, which he described as a further annual third-party audit. It was his evidence, and also the evidence of Drs. Noakes and Beamish in their Exhibit 1324 document called Shifting the Balance, that most aquaculture companies in British Columbia are ISO certified. So you've got the three different levels: the industry, the government, and a third-party certification audit. Fish health management plans, we've discussed them very briefly, Mr. Commissioner. Clearly you've heard evidence that it's a primary tool for minimizing risk of pathogen transfer. It's been made a condition of license in 2003, and what is really telling was when you look at the history of fish health management plans being made a condition of a license, the industry is requiring to fulfill all the various terms of the fish health management plans. It's the same year that Dr. Corman in his assessment notes quote, a statistically significant, close quote, decline in high-risk fish health events on salmon farms. So really, if the goal was to monitor and manage and reduce the risk of significant fish health events, they did. And Dr. Corman, hired by the Commission to look into the statistical summary of the fish health database, came to that conclusion. But I thought the timeline was, it's working. The timeline was instructive to us in that regard. I don't think with the time I have remaining, I'm going to spend a lot of time on what the fish health management plans do. I can commend to you reading paragraph 215 and onward in our submissions describes the processes that occur both in daily monitoring of fish health and also the steps taken if there's a fish health event that triggers further responses. Some of the, at a broad brush level, some of the topics that covered in a fish health management plan, a suite of measures as described by Dr. Peter McKenzie to prevent disease and to improve the health of farmed fish were the broodstock programs which are employed, also disinfection and biosecurity standards relative to eggs, vaccines, incoming water disinfection, daily monitoring, vaccines which are injected into fish prior to them being introduced into the salt water, and then once they're into the marine pens, daily monitoring of trends and changes which are brought to the attention of veterinarians. So the big three companies that you heard of that make up a portion of the BC Salmon Farmers Association all have on-site, on staff, fish health vets who are able to go to their individual sites. Also nutrition, animal welfare standards, predator avoidance. These are all matters which are employed to help reduce stresses to farm fish, and a fish which is not stressed is a fish which is not as likely to get diseased. Just briefly, to go back to the Connors Noakes thing, but to cite a Dr. Corman reference, on our paragraph 222, Dr. Corman, speaking about the issue of moratorium on new sites, notes that salmon farm production levels went up, suggesting more fish per site. In spite of that increased production, Corman's reports concludes the negative effects of salmon farms on wild salmon that were not apparent, and that the mortalities potentially caused by disease remained relatively constant, where high-risk disease events showed a declining trend. So this gets back to the point I made a few minutes ago that says or suggests that diseases on salmon farms are not proportional to salmon farm production, which is one of the fundamental reasons why Dr. Noakes cautions against reliance on Dr. Connors' analysis. We have to talk about Dr. Miller's research, if only to say we know more about Dr. Miller's research now than we all did 2 months ago, and we all know more than we did 4 months ago and 6 months ago, and Dr. Miller knows more. And I'll just summarize that by saying what Dr. Miller first thought she had, a retrovirus, she clearly has walked away from. She's changed, she's evolved, she's learned. And it was very interesting to watch the opponents of aquaculture embracing Dr. Miller's research when they thought it worked for them, and having a more distant perspective on what it is that Dr. Miller's research demonstrates now. The focus seemed to shift from look what Dr. Miller has found to look what they're not letting Dr. Miller tell us. Well, Dr. Miller's work is ongoing. You heard evidence of that. You remember the panel of Dr. Miller and Dr. Garver, and you remember that Dr. Garver, the virologist, is now working more closely with Dr. Miller, and that work continues. The aquaculture industry has been contacted and is cooperating with the DFO and Dr. Miller's research, and it evolves. But I dare say that it's important not to jump to conclusions about what Dr. Miller's research where it may lead us. You know, I referred back to the sea lice story of Broughton Archipelago some 10 years ago. Much more recently, we've got Dr. Miller's virus and whatever it may mean and how it's evolving. And we had the discussion, the marine anemia storm in Conville Bay and Chinook Farms generally about a month ago. Lately, we have an ISA story, and each one of these risks is brought breathlessly to the public in a sensational way, and each one so far has been demonstrated to be something less than advertised. Those are my submissions.
Well, I can speak from here, Mr. Commissioner, I think. My name is Gregory McDade. I'm counsel for Dr. Morton and for the Aquaculture Commission. Mr. Commissioner, firstly, I think I should express my client's strong appreciation to the Canadian government for calling this commission. The survival of the Fraser River salmon is clearly a matter of critical importance for all Canadians. And we want to extend our appreciation to you, Mr. Commissioner, for taking on this critical task, which must seem much more monumental than it did a year and a half ago, or 2 years ago. My client has repeatedly indicated in public her respect for your role and her faith in you and your ultimate task. She has to have that faith. It is clear that left to its own devices, DFO will continue to support aquaculture regardless of the threats to wild fish, until it's too late, until the fish disappear and it's proven beyond a doubt what was lost. Yours, at this time, is a difficult decision. But this commission may be the last chance to take a sensible look at the risks before it's too late. The decision in the future of wild salmon may be in your hands in terms of the outcome of this commission. I must say, we also appreciate the opportunity to have been participants in this commission. We know you have consistently strived to create an atmosphere of civility and collaboration in this commission and have largely succeeded. To the extent that our participation has occasionally made that more difficult, we express our apologies. The decision to add as participants groups like the commercial fishermen, the Conservation Coalition, the Aquaculture Coalition, was, I think at the time, to most, a wise one. But in hindsight, it turns out to have been an essential one. One of the most striking appearances before this commission through the 100 and some days of hearings we've had is the common front, particularly in relation to aquaculture, that we've seen between the Government of Canada, the Government of BC, and the salmon farmers. Objection after objection, legal argument after legal argument. We had those three participants taking common positions, while the commercial fishermen, the conservationists, the First Nations, the recreational fishermen seemed to be on the other side of these matters. If those participants hadn't been here, this commission would have taken a very different approach. Why is it that when one would have expected the Department of Fisheries and Oceans in our government to be standing up for the fish, that they were on the opposite side on so many issues, from the fishermen and the First Nations and the conservationists and the independent science? The only suggestion I have is it can't be a matter about the fish. It's fish versus money. That's the dichotomy that our government seems to be in. I thought it was striking that when the province started its submissions, they talked about the money involved in aquaculture. When my friend Mr. Blair spent 5 minutes talking about the amount of money that's at stake in this matter. Your mandate, Mr. Commissioner, is a slightly clearer one. If there is a dichotomy between fish versus money, I think it's fairly clear that your mandate is the protection of the fish. The other theme that I want to point out that makes your job somewhat difficult, maybe a theme for the issue of aquaculture in this commission, is the difference between proof and risk. We struggle with those questions if we're scientists. We struggle differently with those questions if we're lawyers. And I suppose if we were on a jury using basic common sense, we'd struggle again even differently. It's impossible to prove, you've heard, that directly the disease transfers from a fish farm to a fish Fish die, they sink to the bottom, they get eaten by predators. No one is there in the wild, in the ocean at the moment of disease transfer. That kind of level of proof beyond a balance of a doubt or proof to a scientific certainty, must elude us. No one expects that to be present here. In all complex ecological matters, in all environmental issues, that kind of proof is impossible. Ecologists apply a different set of standards to interpreting the natural world and causation. It isn't about proof. It's about understanding how systems work. It's about understanding how risks take place. You'll recall, Mr. Commissioner, that I phrased a rhetorical question to Mr. Marmarick at the latter days of the hearing. I said, well, okay, if to try and grapple with this question of risk versus proof, would you send your children to a school sited next to an explosives factory? And he laughed and he said, well, no, but the difference is that explosives factories blow up. Well, apply that question to the question of fish farms and disease. There is no question on the evidence before you. It's absolutely proven that fish farms are full of disease. The high density environment of a fish farm is an incubator of disease. Yes, fish farms fight it. On an economic basis, they do the very best job they can to reduce disease. Disease is rampant in fish farms. We heard from Dr. Corman that there are 30 fish health events that are in the high risk category every year out of a population of about 100 fish farms. 30 events a year. We know that there is something like 3 million mortalities of fish every year on fish farms from unexplained causes. These are fish that are protected from predation, well fed, they're not dying of old age, they're dying of unknown causes, but they're rampant with disease. We looked at the disease databases, particularly exhibits 1549, 217. Of the fish health audits, of the thousands of fish that were taken over those years, almost every single fish has symptoms of disease. Half or more of those were given open diagnoses by the veterinarians. In other words, they're not okay, like the Monty Python sketch. We have a dead parrot. We have a dead fish. But they were, and they had symptoms of disease, but if they couldn't fit them neatly into a particular disease category, they were given an open diagnosis. We saw, Mr. Lund, we have exhibit 1565, the database involving the fish health audits at the farm level. We saw that, you'll recall, Mr. Commissioner, the statements that are in that document about, let me just remind you of it. If we can go to the fish health audit and over the column to, further over, please. Yes, all the way over to the next, to column S. Active population, active disease at the population level. On this particular document, you'll find that I think 12 times in just 2000. This document deals only with 2000. This page deals only with 2008 and 2009. Over and over and over again, active diseases at the population level. We saw in the other disease database records that even though almost every single audit identified fish with a disease, that diagnosis of fish, of disease at a population level was only given where there were a certain number of fish dying that exceeded normal levels. So it's only when you have epidemics you get that designation. But disease is part of the everyday life of fish farms. Can we have exhibit 1983 up on the screen, please? We looked at the fish health database, and what Dr. Morton said about ISH and SSC and HEM, I think has been grossly distorted by my learned friends in terms of critiquing what she said. What she said is, here are symptoms identified by the actual veterinarian in charge of this matter. Let's just graph them accordingly. No one is pretending that there's a diagnosis of ISA or a diagnosis of salmon cancer, salmon leukemia. What this is suggesting is there are the symptoms of those matters, and they are unexplained, but they are present. And they are present in large numbers. And that if you graph them, as is done here, you get a very interesting set of numbers. And if you could go down the page to the next graph. Here are those, as you'll recall, Mr. Commissioner, these are the graphs of just the symptoms that Dr. Marty referred to as classic ISA lesions versus the symptoms that Dr. Marty referred to as classic marine anemia lesions, symptoms. And there's a strong correlation between those two sets of symptoms. Now, no one on our side of the table has drawn conclusions about what that means. That's for the scientists. But those are there's a significant correlation that requires some explanation. And the suggestion that somehow these fish are all healthy in these fish farms just doesn't stand up to the facts. And the correlation is remarkable in terms of the 2009 salmon and the time that the smolts were swimming past the fish farms. Mr. Lund, can you put up page 33 of our argument? That's the same chart, Mr. Commissioner, with the with just the ISA classic lesions removed and just the marine anemia symptoms. That's corrected from in terms of the chart below, in terms of the dates. That peaked, as you'll see, in the last quarter of 2006 and the first quarter in 2007. Just prior to the smolts swimming past the farms. If we could have page 46 of the argument, Mr. Lund. This is another chart that you've seen, Mr. Commissioner. This again, these are not just invented numbers. They come straight off Dr. Corman and Dr. Marty's charts. This is a straight summary of mortalities. Now, showing a very similar spike in mortalities at exactly the same time around the marine harvest farms, which are in the inside passage along the migration route. Now, just before I leave that point, I just want to address something that one of my learned friends had some question about. In fact, I think the term was fanciful. And that's the question of the rearing of the Chinooks in the Discovery passage. If we could go to the chart at page 20 of the argument. Mr. Commissioner, this is the document prepared by Dr. Corman from Fish Farm Data itself. It lists the stocking of every single fish farm in every single month. It includes when they were stocked and when they were harvested. Is it possible, Mr. Lung, to sort by column G, or is that asking too much?
See what I can do.
Column G is simply the name of the facilities. Mr. Commissioner, if you sort by that name just alphabetically, one ends up with a document where every single fish farm has a from 2002 down to 2010 history of when they're stocked and what fish they were carrying. If one takes the 10 farms that are present in the wild salmon narrows that you've seen the photo about and that I'll take you to in short order, one can look at each of those farms and get the history. Conville Bay was the one that we focused on during the hearings. And if one goes down to Conville Bay, one finds that it had Pacific salmon, it had Chinooks, up until June of 2007. After that, it didn't. But Dr. Morton, in her report, sets out a chart where she did that for each of the farms in the wild salmon narrows. And when one does that for each of the farms, what one gets is a chart with how many Chinooks were being reared in the discovery in the wild salmon narrows from year to year. That chart shows no Chinook salmon in 2000, after the spring of 2007 into 2008. That's what this is coming from. It's not fanciful. It simply comes straight from the data produced by the Commission. I won't take up any more of your time, but to say that that's a very simple task that's done, and it's shown in her report. So in other words, in 2007, when the smolts were swimming past Chinook farms, full of disease, we suggest, they were in a very different place than in 2008, when they were swimming past those same farms, which were either fallow or had converted over to Atlantics and would have a different set of diseases. The next point I want to make is the suggestion that I'm troubled by in some of my learned friends' arguments, that somehow endemic diseases are of lesser risk than exotic ones. And there is a suggestion, both, especially in Dr. Noakes' report, that somehow if a disease is endemic, because it's present in some proportion in wild salmon, it's not something you have to worry about. And that if you can just control for egg importation and prevent the introduction of exotic disease, then somehow the wild salmon will be fine. Mr. Commissioner, I strongly suggest that that is a completely mistaken view and ignores the science. If I can have Exhibit 1484 up on the screen, please. And you recall, Mr. Commissioner, that we addressed a number of these studies during the hearing. Endemic diseases. Let me just look at the first paragraph, the first abstract there, Mr. Lund. The intensive farming creates conditions for parasite growth and transmission dramatically different from what parasites experience in wild host populations. The abstract talks about emerging diseases or re-emerging diseases, sometimes in highly virulent forms. That's the real flaw in fish farms. They take diseases and they evolve them. They take endemic diseases that are harmless and they turn them into diseases that are killers. Even ISA, which you'll hear more about, I suppose, in December, but is a disease that in Norway is hypothesized to have existed in the wild in a completely harmless form until the coming of fish farming. if you just go to the next, the column across, the second column in the same place, Mr. Lund. Intensive farming conditions increase parasite virulence. They turn ordinary diseases into killers. If you can go to the next page, if I could, the second paragraph on the left column. Intensive farm, no, sorry, just a little higher. There we are. That paragraph there. Intensive farming of plants and animals creates conditions for parasite transmission in goat that are drastically different from conditions experienced by parasites in the wild host populations. That's pure science, proven science. The question of which particular disease and when is not the issue. The fact is we're creating a dramatically changed environment every time we create a fish farm. If I could ask you to go to 3 pages forward, Mr. Lund, to page 62. On the second column, you'll see the heading, Parasite Life History and Virulence. If I look about 10 lines further down that column, therefore, very high host densities on intensive farms are likely to favor higher levels of virulence because the constraints due to the costs of virulence are relaxed. Use of vaccines, of course, increase virulence. They work for the fish that are vaccinated, but they create new strains that are immune. You'll see about 10 lines further down from there, the selection for early transmission results in increased virulence. And the other point, if we could go to the next page, Mr. Lund, page 63, under fish farming and parasite evolution, there's another point that is uncontested. If you could just highlight that first paragraph, Mr. Lund. About 8-9 lines into there, Mr. Commissioner, you'll see for migrating marine fish species, this enormous increase in population size is associated with another change, year-round presence of fish in coastal seawater, which provides a highly predictable resource for parasites. Fish farms change the way in which parasites work. We've heard that about sea lice. They create a year-long environment. It works the same for viruses. If I could have Exhibit 1482 up on the screen. Another document we looked at with I believe Dr. Kent. If I could go to the second column, Mr. Lund, about 10 lines up from the bottom. Properties of the virus, like virulence, infectious dose, and routes of transmission are factors that are important determinants of whether a disease will emerge or remain sporadic. The rest of this paper deals with pancreas disease, with HSMI, with ISA, with a number of emerging diseases that are a problem in Norway. Our point here, Mr. Commissioner, is this. It isn't plasmacytoid leukemia, or IHN, or ISA that is what we require proof of. If it isn't one of those diseases, it'll be one of these. It's not a question of which disease, it's only a matter of when. The whole experience of fish farming in every country, everywhere it's been, is that sooner or later a disease emerges that is devastating. Do we have to wait for that to occur before we do something about it? That's the question before this commission. The next point I'd like to address you on is the question of disclosure. These fish health databases that, through your good efforts, were made available to the public and available to this commission, and from which we learned so much about what's going on in fish farms, compared to what we were being told, which is basically don't worry, there's absolutely no problem whatsoever, will never reoccur. I heard the evidence from senior bureaucrats at DFO who told you that the watchword now is going to be transparency and disclosure. And the public will get full information. I'd like to go to the terms of the license. So can I ask that Exhibit 1594 be put up? Now, you heard debate, Mr. Commissioner, between me and a number of witnesses on this. And given the time limits, we were never able to fully get to the bottom of this. If we could go to page 12. We're told in the, I think in the reply of the province, but I might be wrong, it might be Canada's reply. There's a suggestion that somehow we've been misleading, that there are all these sections of the license that require this disclosure, and Section 9 is the one that's pointed out to you. If we could just blow up Section 9.3. Let's just see how the license works. Section 9.3 is, I suggest, the only real requirement to report fish health and mortality event information to the Government of Canada. It's only that information that is reported to the Government of Canada that's going to ever be present on the website. Section 9.3 is exactly, it's not what I've overlooked in cross-examination, it's exactly the foundation of it. 9.3 says it shall be reported as per Appendix 8, the Fish Health and Fish Mortality Event Report, which I'm going to take you to in a second. But if I could just turn back a page. Section 7, maybe just another half page there to get to the start of Section 7. Yes, thank you. Section 7 doesn't require reporting to the Government of Canada. Section 7 says the license holder shall keep an accurate record of stocking activity and fish health for the facility, including the following. And then there's a list of things that the company must keep on site. They must make that available to the government on request. But there's no requirement to report it regularly, and no ability to ever collect that data in a way in which it will be made available to the public. Can we scroll down to Section 8? There it is. Now this Section 8 is the whole section of the license dealing with fish health event response. This is what our government expects of license holders. Should a fish health event occur, the license holder shall take action to manage the event, undertake follow-up measures to determine the cause of the outbreak and the efficacy of the management measures, and implement a response plan to contain an infectious disease if suspected or diagnosed. This has all been privatized over to the company. The company gets to choose what action to take to manage the event. The company gets to undertake what follow measures, and the company gets to implement a response plan. And I pause here to say this only applies to what is determined to be a fish health event. And the evidence you've heard is that fish health events are defined as, in effect, an abnormal outbreak of disease. Normal daily disease, which we've heard can be up to 10% of the fish farm, if there's 3 million mortalities to a 30 million fish, that doesn't produce this. In the province's argument, they say about plasmacytoid leukemia, I think it's page 130 or 131, they say that wouldn't even constitute a fish health event because there's no treatment known for plasmacytoid leukemia. So that a fish health event is a very limited subset of all of the disease epidemics. The database that I put up on the screen, Exhibit 1565, only those 12 active disease at the population level where there's treatment would be determined to be fish health events. That's what Section 8 refers to. Now, if we could go to Appendix 8 at page 35. This is the sum total, Mr. Commissioner. If the Government of Canada has their way, and if you make no recommendations to the contrary, of what would be reported for fish health events and fish mortalities. And if we could just highlight Part C. This is what is to be completed for each individual health event. So on those 30 or so outbreaks of disease, or a dozen outbreaks of disease, I don't know which one is right, that occur each year on fish farms that are really epidemics. This is the level of detail that our government is asking for. Diagnosis, one word, one little box. Were treated fish mixed with non-treated fish? Yes or no? Estimate mortalities, number, name of drug and prescription, date treatment consented, date treatment ended. And just over the page, if you could, Mr. Lund, just to be complete. There we go. Treatment information. Response description. That's what the public of Canada is going to get to know. Now, if emerging diseases are coming forward that haven't yet been diagnosed, and we've heard evidence on numerous occasions. We heard the evidence of the plasmacytoid leukemia outbreaks in the 1988 to 1991 span, and how the DFO responded or didn't respond to those examinations. We heard of the IHN outbreaks that went on for 3 years in 2001 to 2003. We've heard of Dr. Miller's virus and the evidence of how quickly DFO is reacting to that. The public won't know until it's actually identified as a particular disease and identified as a fish health event. Independent scientists will never have the information they need to be able to identify this. This is insufficient amount of information in my submission. And it's to call that transparency in my respectful submission is simply misleading. Might be an appropriate time to take a break.
The hearing will recess for 15 minutes.